Thanks, Kirsten, and really thank you to ATARC for the invitation to speak. I am probably preaching to the choir here when I say AI is perhaps one of the most consequential generalized technology of the 21st century. Certainly from our day-to-day lives perspective, our email junk mail filter wouldn't work as well. Our Spotify playlist wouldn't work as well. None of our phone will unlock without some form of AI assistance. I think that's true for the federal government as well, given the speed, given the diversity of AI solutions that are coming online. I think this is really the algorithmic capability is really the next frontier in terms of how federal agencies deliver their services. But certainly along that comes with really sort of significant challenges to address, not only from a performance perspective, but I'm sure we've all seen news headlines around disparate impact. For example, facial recognition algorithm not able to recognize brown faces or women's face as well as other demographics. So those kind of issue is something that really does concern Congress, but more specifically GAO as an oversight entity. And one of the reasons we developed the AI accountability framework is, when we were doing a bit of a horizon scanning back in 2018, I think we already had a pretty good sense of how consequential AI technology would be. But the fact of the matter is a lot of these AI frameworks out there were very high level, very aspirational. A lot of them talk about AI should do no harm. A lot of talk about AI should be transparent, should be accountable. I think all of these are very laudable goals, but it's very difficult to quantify what that means to the day-to-day practitioners from a data science perspective, from a program manager perspective. So we actually have this sort of interesting hypothesis that perhaps using oversight as a trust but verified mechanism on not just on the performance attributes of AI, but also some of these biases and disparate impact consequences of AI might really help to sort of really establish the concept of a responsible AI in terms of how those principles can be sort of manifested into sort of various implementations of AI. And really that's the reason why we embark on this journey of developing the AI accountability framework. As some of you may know, there are 170 plus or so different AI ethical frameworks out there. What we really wanted to do is push the altitude of these principles down to the kind of practices, procedure, and questions that are meaningful to the implementers themselves. And that's really how we're really start translating our ability to evaluate not only the governance of the AI, but also the underlying data, the learning, the deployment, but ultimately the scaling of AI solutions as well. So I'll go over the sort of sections of the AI accountability framework. But what's, I think, unique for GAO is that we're also looking to be the practitioners of AIs ourselves. Not only do we need to figure out the oversight angles, but just like with any other entity, we aspire to adopt AI capabilities for our own mission and operational use. And I think having that sort of lens as a practitioner really help us understand when we say AI is complicated, what that really means beyond some of these academic principles. So our tagline is that AI is one of several emerging technology that we really want to strive to make sure that oversight is at parity with the technological advancement. So from an innovation lab perspective, which is the other hat that I wear at GAO, in addition to being GAO's first chief data scientist, is really sort of looking at that sort of dual hatted role in terms of AI, blockchain, cloud services, et cetera. How do we adopt these capabilities ourselves, but also how do we figure out how to conduct the kind of empirical oversight functions that GAO is well known for? So let's jump into it. Certainly, again, probably won't be surprising to this crowd that the federal use of AI is increasing exponentially year over year. And you can just observe that through the annual level of funding. Here, we're citing a sort of 2022 non-defense budget of $1.6 billion on AI. But if you account for all of the items listed in the NDAA, that number likely exceeds north of $6 billion. And so that is, an extraordinary rate in terms of just funding into AI development. And certainly there are no shortage of other, I would say, ancillary type of efforts. So for example, OPM recently issued a job series for 1560, specifically codifying data science as a job series. There are a lot of sort of conversations around AI as a sort of a competitive pillar in the world stage. So, with this in mind, GAO recognizes that AI likely is not the fad of the moment. It's something that will be with us. We have a large portfolio of oversight work that we have already done around use of AI. So for example, how AI is being applied in sort of medical diagnostic perspective, how AI is being used for drug discovery, how AI is being used in sort of a facial recognition, law enforcement type of context. But the AI accountability framework is really one of our truly foresight-oriented product, looking at how can we adapt the kind of accountability questions across all types and flavors of AI implementation, and looking from the sort of a life cycle perspective. And so, moving forward in terms of when we start talking about AI accountability, what I actually found was perhaps not as useful is dwell on the definitions of AI. We tend to talk about AI in terms of its evolutionary cycle. So wave one, sort of borrow this concept from DARPA. They call it wave one, the AI primarily driven by expert rules, maybe not so much machine learning, but definitely more linear programming kind of capability, whereas we are squarely in what they call the wave two of AI, which is AI solution mostly made of machine learning algorithm or systems of machine learning algorithm capable of sort of scope limited decision and support. What's coming down the pipeline is sort of a wave three of AI, and these are already starting to, exiting the sort of a research domain. And these are the AI that are more cognition capable, able to operate within sort of a data sparsity type of environment, able to do some basic reasoning. So, just put it in sort of practical terms. I think my daughter, who just turned 2, is able to do the kind of reasoning and cognition far better than the most sophisticated machine learning model can today. So, while we've already seen the tremendous opportunity and value generated through machine learning type of AI, I think we're still in relative infancy when it comes to that journey. So the idea here is to get the oversight posture right, so that we're not playing the kind of catch up that sometimes the oversight bodies tends to do in terms of waiting for some plateau of technology maturity. So rather than focusing on devoting, definition of AI, like I said, we try to adopt this more of an evolutionary perspective on AI. Again, first wave is really based on a priori expert knowledge. Second wave, where we are right now, is mostly machine learning model based. And then the third wave is, contextually aware, cognition and reasoning capable type of AI that I think more and more will start to manifest itself in the next 5 to 10 years. And so back in 2020, in the middle of pandemic, as we were embarking on this journey of developing the AI accountability framework, the way that we went about it is really to convene what we call the Comptroller General Forum. Essentially, is a panel of experts to really talk about wide-ranging issues. Some of these are purely technical, performance-related attribute. We got into in terms of the criteria of evaluation. We got into in terms of some of these biases, in terms of some of these disparate impacts, societal impacts of AI. And one very interesting sort of observation, perhaps towards the end, is that there's a real danger that we perhaps live in this echo chamber of assuming that accountable AI is a consensus view. That may not necessarily be the case because, even to this day, data scientists are routinely taught to focus on using the most exotic mathematical statistical techniques to squeeze that extra ounce of accuracy, precision, whatever the performance metrics that we want to be measured by. And then all of a sudden, there are sort of discussions around how data scientists should also be philosophers or ethicists or civil liberty advocates, and where these technical experts may not necessarily have the training nor the sort of perspective and experience in handling and that sort of aspects of AI. And so there were a lot of interesting discussions around what were the roles and responsibilities of sort of various stakeholders in the AI development cycle. So it was a fascinating, a very sort of cross-functional, we had government entities represented, IG entities represented, industry players, academics, nonprofit organizations, and academics involved in a lot of these panel discussions. And what really came out of this was this AI accountability framework. And I'll talk more about how we sort of organize the content in a way that we think it's logical. But for those that are interested, the report itself is available through gao.gov. The product number is GAO-21-519SP. Again, this is sort of an example of our sort of forward-looking foresight type of publication that really aimed at how do we have a conversation around accountable AI in a way that is verifiable, in a way that we can actually issue sort of audit opinions around. And so I think this is the beginning of that effort. And as we sort of move forward, we're certainly coordinating ourselves with NIST. I know they're just recently issued a sort of a draft version of their AI risk management framework. We're having conversation with OSTP. We're having conversation with many of our state and local as well as international partner to really articulate the need for AI to be responsive, to be accountable, not just focused necessarily on the sort of performance attributes of AI, especially as we talk about AI in the context of being competitive. And we know there are some international adversaries out there that may not necessarily be too concerned about civil liberty, may not necessarily focus too much about the ethics of AI. I think it's ever more important for us to double down the value that we want to promulgate as a democratic society in terms of how AI should and can coexist with some of these performance considerations. So the way that we organize the framework is really looking at not necessarily any given flavor of AI. So we do recognize, AI implementation in sort of autonomous vehicle setting will look very different than AI in medical diagnostic and financial services in, HR. Whatever the case might be, but we try to look at it from a life cycles point of view. Designing of the AI certainly looks very different than the development of AI, certainly looks very different than the deployment of AI. But one very specific element that we wanted to include is the concept of continuous monitoring. AI in particular, right, is one of those technologies that you can't just deploy and forget it, given the fragilities of machine learning models and how they're susceptible to intentional or unintentional manipulation. The concept of data drift is certainly real. So, from just, continuous accountability perspective, continuous monitoring is a concept that auditors are very familiar with. And certainly it's a need that we're stressing. But the point is, rather than focusing on specific applications of AI, what we try to adapt our framework is span across the life cycle from design through development, through deployment, and all the way through continuous monitoring, which also talks about the scaling of AI, right? I mean, as these proof of concepts are being tested and are being proven, Are the scaling done appropriately? Are some of the governance expanded and in a way that makes sense, whether geographically, whether demographically, whatever the case might be, or are we having a conversation whether AI is still an appropriate mission delivery mechanism, or are there some conversations around sunsetting that may be appropriate? So this is the overall life cycle that we have organized the content of the AI accountability framework. And within that life cycle, we have these 4 specific pillars, one around the governance of AI, one around the performance of AI, one around the data that underpins AI, and then last, like I mentioned, the monitoring activity that are required throughout the AI lifecycle. And in each of this pillar, we further delineate between sort of a macro level perspective as well as the micro level perspective. And I'll just take governance as an example. There's certainly macro level governance around the organization roles and responsibility. So for example, many entities are now appointing roles such as the chief AI officers or chief AI ethics officer. But what does that really mean? Is that person empowered to make the change? Is there an actual integration of that role in a sort of clear and delineated way? Are there sort of governance process in place so that when something does go wrong, whether it's disparate impact with this performance-related issue, that there are mechanisms to review that systematically, but also in a way that allows sort of almost similar to the incident response on a cybersecurity domain that the organization can undertake. But there's also governance at the system level, right? How resilient is individual machine learning model. And once we string together those machine learning model to make into a system, or do those governance still apply consistently relative to the sort of requirements documentation, relative to sort of variable selection process, relative to some of these sort of due process kind of discussion. So if an impacted audience, a sort of constituent that's impacted by the AI system, if is the result transparent? If there's a disagreement, is there a sort of escalation process to make sure that humans are continually in the loop, on the loop, but never out of the loop? So that's an example where we're using, within governance, how we're delineating between a macro and a micro level. So same thing on the data, right? Training data, validation data being used to develop individual machine learning model, that's one thing. And there are very specific sort of activity that surrounds the governance of data, complete, accurate, whether those variable selection process were indicative of a prediction power, et cetera. But we want to make sure that once those AI models are then operating in a systemic level, that the sort of incoming production data continues to adhere to that kind of quality, reliability, and representativeness, and to really, to the extent possible, minimize the idea of data-driven model drift. Same thing on the performance side, right? Their performance attribute at the individual machine learning model, component level. Want to make sure that the performance as a whole continues to adhere to the, consistent with the requirement, to the objective, to the mission delivery. And so, we codify, again, a number of practices, questions, and specifically procedures that oversight entity can apply to really scrutinize on all of these pillars. And then last but not the least, again, just stressing the importance of monitoring. And that's not just on the program office side of the house where the continuous monitoring is important, but it's also a wake-up call for the oversight entities such as GAO as well. For those that may be familiar with GAO report, we usually do our work at the behest of Congress. And starting with the pandemic, we have begun to do a lot more continuous auditing, but usually it's sort of episodic, right? I mean, I think AI is one of those topics that we can't just every 18 months come around and kick the tire and do the evaluation. And frankly, an audit report cannot take 18 months to generate specifically for AI. By the time that audit report comes out, the relevance of that report likely would have faded long ago. So how do we do continuous monitoring? How do we sort of generate the kind of assurance that we will need to be able to, in a timely way, in a contemporaneous way that sort of keeps up with the advancements of technology? And the second part of the monitoring is, continually assess whether the scaling and sustainment of AI is being done appropriately, consistently with the governance, and whether at certain point a sunsetting of those capabilities makes sense. Right. So again, just from a AI lifecycle perspective, we have laid out these 4 pillars. I think that at a sort of a level that applies to all kinds of implementations of AI. One of the key things that we do articulate here, that accountable AI here is a team sports, right? It's not just the responsibilities of data scientists, it's not just the responsibility of software developer. How do we make sure that, across those governance, performance, data, and monitoring pillars, that we are including privacy experts, we're including risk management professional, we're including the users of those AI systems, we're including the individuals that are being affected by those AI decisions that are being made. How do we include civil liberty advocate? How do we include legal counsels? Those are the kind of sort of skill sets that need to coalesce, and it's unlikely to reside with one person. And if I may sort of expand that a little outwardly, since I think a lot of folks on today's conversation is from a private sector, as we were developing the AI accountability framework, we did had a number of discussion with major technology providers to say, hypothetically speaking, if GAO were to walk through the door, in terms of those product and service company developing, models that can be bought off of the marketplace, et cetera, what kind of artifacts will these companies be ready to, show someone like an auditor from GAO in terms of that, everything that I just laid out, from a governance, from a performance training, data perspective, so that we can reasonably delineate whether, if there's a disparate impact sort of consequences, whether that originated with the model that were sold in the marketplace, or whether those originated from the subsequent customization being done by those agencies. So I think even within the industry provider, there are a lot of conversation that needs to happen relative to these type of routine questions around the accountability of their AI products and services. And I know there are a lot of organizations out there that are starting to explore the concept of, for example, nutritional label for AI products, sort of classification of sort of AI capabilities. So I think this is all in a very positive development in terms of how do we coalesce towards an accountable AI environment. But more work needs to be done. Like I mentioned before, we are in active discussions with NIST, with OSTP, with many other sort of government entity, to make sure that we have some level of interoperability. With 170 plus or so different frameworks floating out there, that is starting to sound like a recipe for confusion, a recipe for sort of kind of disparate compliance regime that may not necessarily yield the kind of result that we want. So how do we make sure that we are interoperable? But also, I think the next frontier is now specifically to create instantiation of sort of accountable AI models that perhaps looks very different in a national security domain versus financial services domain versus healthcare HR, et cetera, or self-driving car, as I was mentioning before. So there's certainly a lot of work ahead of us, but the idea of treating accountable AI as a team sport, I think, will be a central theme throughout that journey. I've already mentioned the way that we organize the framework itself is across these 4 pillars: governance, data, performance, and monitoring. And within each of those pillars, and really speak to not only to the auditors, which these are the audit procedures that we laid out consistent with our generally accepted government auditing standards, or the Yellow Book standards. But we've also laid out key practices and key questions, and using a simple language, we really try to avoid using technical jargons, so that these type of concept can be absorbed to their sort of day-to-day operation, day-to-day practice as data scientists, as program managers, as compliance professional, et cetera. And the way that we are sort of promoting the AI accountability framework is that this is how GAO will be using as a roadmap for us to conduct evaluation of AI implementation. So think of it as an open book test. Just as with many other areas of oversight, we have made this type of framework sort of publicly accessible, so that there should be no surprises when GAO is asked to perform an evaluation of a sort of AI program, and that this is the roadmap that we will be following. So we are in the initial stage of working across with all of our mission teams to make sure that they are well versed in the framework itself. They have the knowledge around the various expected artifacts that they should be able to see. What does the training data look like? What does the model cards look like? What should a sort of sound governance documentation look like, et cetera? And most recently, I think one of the very first audit product is really looking at the DoD's AI posture writ large, but we certainly expect a lot more of AI oversight to sort of come online. So where do we go from here, right? So, I talked about we're collaborating with OSTP, we're collaborating with NIST, but certainly are continue to talk this in discussion with our international partners as well. I think this is a critical area where GAO can play in terms of using audit as a sort of wedge to manifest accountable AI. But also at the international stage, this is where I think we have an opportunity to advocate that accountability and responsible use of AI can coexist with performance and technical advancements of AI. So just because we talk AI in terms of the competitive posture doesn't mean we necessarily shy away from the accountability, civil liberty, privacy concerns. So as we march into wave 3 of AI, we want to make sure that we have the oversight sort of well handled in terms of the first wave and the second wave of AI, so that as we get into more cognition ready contextual AI solutions, and that we're not playing catch up relative to how we might address some of these accountability challenges. I mentioned, GAO already has a body of AI oversight work. Some of these are traditional audit. Some of these are more of a forward-looking technology assessments. So I'll just highlight a few. Certainly we are we're just now completing the third part of artificial intelligence in healthcare. The first one was looking at drug development. The second one was looking at patient care, and we will be issuing the third in the series sometime this year. We have looked at forensic technology relative to biometric identity verification and facial recognition. We have done a number of sort of other AI related. The bottom line, AI is something that we recognize will pervade all aspects of the federal operation. So all of our mission teams are aware that there likely will be a component of AI no matter what the oversight topic might look like. So this is sort of also the capacity building exercise for GAO to make sure that we have the resources needed to undertake these type of evaluation not just necessarily through literature research or talking to subject matter experts, but how do we do so empirically? Do we collect, data? Do we collect models? Do we try to replicate results independently through our own analytical environment? And what does that mean in terms of how we issue our assurance report? So I think those are all important questions that we're sorting through right now. But more importantly, as I mentioned earlier, we also want to be the practitioners of AI ourselves. So we don't want to just talk about accountable AI from a sort of a purely conceptual academic perspective. Through the work of an innovation lab, we're actually developing a number of sort of NLP-based solutions. We're starting to develop, based on methodological alignment, the appropriate use of different types of machine learning model, so that we know when we're using these models for our own work that it is actually adhering to the Yellow Book standards relative to efficiency, effectiveness, economics, ethics, and equity. And so those are the guiding principles for GAO. But going forward, again, we do recognize the body of AI work likely will increase. So how do we collaborate with not only the IG offices, but other sort of institutions out there to make sure that we overall, as a federal government, have the capacity to do the kind of empirical assessment in a timely way. All right, so I know that was me talking a lot, talking really fast, and I see there are some questions coming. So Gary, your questions around how will GAO identify and select programs for audit? Great question. I'll answer that generally. There are three ways that GAO conducts our oversight work. One is through statutes. So if you scan through the omnibus or the NDAA, usually the sentence starts with GAO shall every month or every year or whatever the case might be, do some type of assessment. That is a signal to us that there is a statutory mandate for GAO to look at certain programs. Certainly AI has been mentioned in those statutes. The second way that GAO does work is really through congressional requests. Those could come from the committees, both on the Senate and the House level. Those could come from individual members. And so it really kind of depends. And then the third sort of avenue for GAO to initiate work is really what we call the Comptroller General Authority, or CGA. This is where Comptroller General Gene Dodaro, his vision is for GAO to focus on the most intractable challenges facing the federal government. And we can reasonably make an argument that AI falls within that category. So he has the authority to initiate oversight work in areas where he deems is important for GAO to have sort of a perspective on. So usually those are the three avenues in which GAO sort of undertake our oversight. I will add there's an emerging sort of collaboration that we are beginning to really embrace. This is under the Joint Financial Management Improvement Program, or the JFMIP. It's a fairly unique statutory umbrella that allows GAO to collaborate specifically with Treasury, OMB, and OPM on topics of mutual interest. And I mentioned it's a relatively novel because usually auditors don't like to interact with auditee in a collaborative sense. We usually collaborate on an evaluative sense. So this is where I think GAO also recognizes, in addition to our sort of portfolio of evaluation work, there's really value that GAO can bring to the table, especially with the lessons learned and success story that we've gained through the Innovation Lab, that we could, in a collaborative way, share at least with Treasury, OMB, and OPM. So through JFMIP, we actually have two initiatives that are ongoing. One is around the use of identity verification to reduce improper payments. And the second one is the exploration of a non-cryptocurrency blockchain technology to really set up the foundational knowledge to say, well, what does it take to set up a blockchain, not just as a prototype within one agency, but how do we do it across agency boundary relative to operations, cybersecurity costs, and oversight implications, et cetera. So it's actually quite an exciting, I think, perspective shift for GAO to be sitting at the table and collaborate and really try to tackle these sort of systemic challenges facing the government. Gary, your second question is around, are you communicating with the Federal CIO Council, advising the AI program to adhere to GAO framework? The short answer is yes. Since the publication of the AI Oversight Framework, we've been on a pretty consistent sort of roadshow, if you will, talking with a variety of organizations in terms of what the AI Accountability Framework means. What is our perspective in terms of how we will approach AI oversight, but what more work needs to be done, not just from GAO, but from whole of government, as well as academics and industry partners and nonprofits collectively to move this conversation forward. So the short answer is yes. I think we talked to the CIO, actually not the CIO, the CDO Council. And by the way, you mentioned the CIO Council. One of the sort of internal efforts within GAO in terms of our capacity building is also our modernization of our data strategy. So data science is certainly a big component of that. How do we leverage cloud services? How do we make sure that our analytical capacity can evolve, especially in the eras of AI? But we're also embarking simultaneously on the journey of data literacy to make sure that our analyst cohort can, as appropriate, scope in AI either as a mission delivery function or as an evaluative work that we need to do. And they're able to interpret not only the input, but more importantly, the output coming out of AI system, because categorically, these are probabilistic, right? So if an AI system says 65% likelihood that this looks like an anomaly, well, what does that really mean? Is that a yes or is that a no? So we want to make sure that our analyst cohort have the capacity to not only evaluate the input, understand the output, but also be able to sort of craft that kind of narrative that I think a lot of times very challenging to do, especially in a sort of predictive statistical kind of output. And the third aspects of that data strategy is data governance, certainly garbage in, garbage out, right? AI is no different. When we say AI potentially is biased, I mean, that's a term of art, right? AI can faithfully represent what the data itself is learning from. It's the data itself that most of the time is biased. And so how do we have a sort of robust data governance process to make sure not only are we answering the completeness and accuracy questions, but also making sure that the assessments of the representativeness and then disparate impact, and to the extent that we can use synthetic data or augmentation data to sort of mitigate those risks is something that will be part of our data governance structure as well. So yeah, I mean, it's not just an outward articulation of the AI oversight, but also inward use of AI as well as our own capacity strengthening to make sure that agency as a whole is really ready for this algorithmic era. Jeffrey has a question. Does GAO perform testing of new AI technologies? If so, how does that process work? That's an interesting question. So I lead the innovation lab. So as far as our own work, we have certainly evaluated a number of commercially available AI technologies. I'll just cite one example. GAO has over 100 years worth of reports that really, it's a gold mine of information if we're able to mine them. So what we have done is actually develop a geo-specific topic modeling. Now, originally our approach was trying to use commercially available tools. Long story short, what we found was that many of these commercially available tools were trained on commercial data. And the process it takes to retrain those models based on geo-specific type of vernacular writing style it would have taken just as long and then trying to come up with our own sort of customized model where we can control the performance sort of parameters of those machine learning models. So that's the, long story short, that's the path that we went down, but we certainly have evaluated different available commercial solution. And what we try to do is really be agnostic around what flavor, whether it's commercial, whether it's homegrown, as long as we're able to sort of solve the problem at hand in a way that is compliant with our generally accepted government auditing standards is the approach that we take. Now, I'll say, we don't have a formal testing program evaluating all AI technologies out there. That's not the mandate of GAO, but certainly if that's within the request, we will do so. But at the same time, this is sort of a categorical statement I'll just make, is that perhaps not all AI technologies are appropriate for GAO use, because the Yellow Book standard does very strongly advocate for transparency, equity, and sort of efficiency and effectiveness type of conversations, and one attribute in particular, transparency. So a lot of commercial tools oftentimes are considered black box. So if we're not able to peek into it and understand the rationale, let's just assume that we're using some sort of supervised learning, that may already be an area that GAO itself might shy away from in lieu of something more linearly explainable. So, we're after all an agency of professional critics, right? So we tend to sort of distrust black box approach. And so for our own use, we tend to favor something that we can see the inner mechanics, understand fully the inputs and the output and all of the hyperparameter training that we are able to adjust so that we can fully satisfy the requirements under the Yellow Book standards. So hopefully that's a sort of a long-winded answer. Again, we don't have a sort of formal AI evaluation sort of capabilities, but as needs arise, we will sort of specifically focus on those sub areas. Any other questions?
Well, if there are no other questions, and if there are, go ahead and use the chat or cut me off, that's fine. But I want to thank you, Taka, for such an excellent presentation, and our audience for sending in those questions. While I have everyone here, I do want to turn the attention over to our latest working group that we're spinning up under this AI data mission area. So if you'll take a look at my screen, in order to get to this page, by the way, you just have to go to mission areas, select AI and data analytics, and you'll see all the different activities happening under this particular mission area. And the latest working group that I'm referring to is on warfighter health. We already have established 2 chairs, one government chair, Major Scott McKeithen with the Air Force, and the JAKE, the Joint AI Center, as well as Dr. Claudia Camila Taka. She's an advisor chair with the C3 think tank. So you can click this button to learn a little bit more about the Warfighter Health Group. This group is stemming from a roundtable discussion that we had partnered with the JAKE and Tradewind. There's a white paper that came out of that discussion. And the phase of this working group that they are in right now is that we are drafting up a charter to outline the goals of this working group and the overall purpose. We're still selecting leadership. So if you feel like you want to be a government co-chair along with Major McKeithen, or an industry chair, or if you're with academia, an academic chair, advisor chair, please reach out to me and let me know a little bit about what you think you could contribute to this group. And we'd really love to have you on leadership. If you're interested in participating as a contributing member, we'll also be taking members at some point once we've established our charter. So just know that this is out here as an option to get further involved with ATARC. Or if you know anyone that works within your agency you think would be a really great fit for this group, please send them my way, because we'd really love to establish the working group team. Any other questions before we close out? Taka, I saw you shared a link in the chat.
Yeah, that's the link to the AI accountability framework itself. And for all the other related GAO AI oversight product, probably the easiest way, just GAO space, whatever the AI topic might be, that's probably the easiest way to have those products show up.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And for anyone who would like to view the recording, I saw Yolanda sent me a message. She would like to listen to the recording. Happy to share it with you once it's processed, and I can share this out to anyone else who's interested.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thanks everyone. Feel free to drop me a note if you have any feedback on the accountability framework, the AI accountability framework itself. We don't view this as an end-all be-all. If anything else, it's simply a version 1 of that. As the technology itself evolves, we certainly look forward to updating it, but really would love to hear some feedback in terms of the good and the bad, right? We didn't say that we necessarily got it right the first time, but we think this is a reasonable first step approach. And if there's any comments, that we're certainly happy to consider those for future edits.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And our next speaker for this mission area in a month from now is pending agency approval, but hopefully Kishamandra Paul, the CDO over at the Veterans Affairs, will be approved to share something with us, and I'll let the group know once that's approved. So thank you all again. Thank you so much, Taka. We hope to have you back again.
Sounds good. Have a great rest of the afternoon.
You too. Bye-bye.